6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit and we have liftoff at 2:13. Thrust, and it has cleared the tower.
Prepare yourself for a world of consciousness. This is
Good morning, everybody. Conley here with the Science Nights in the morning. All three nights are assembled today. We have Dr. Anirban Bhattacharjee. We have Dr. Thomas Schiller. And all the way from Australia, we have Dr. Sean Graham. What's going on, Sean?
Hey, guys. What's going on?
Oh, man. Good stuff. Good stuff. Beautiful day.
Good.
And we are going to be taking a real walk down memory lane. All the way through our DNA. And we're talking about the ancient origins of DNA. And what is DNA? How does it work? And how does it kind of evolve over what is the time scale that we're at right now?
Well, I think we're going to try and talk about a sort of shorter time scale with human DNA.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So ancient human
DNA. Ancient DNA. Yeah, so there's, I guess, two ways of looking at this. Like, if you look at the history of DNA itself, it goes back to the beginning of life, and we're not going to start there. We're going to talk about really old DNA and about as old the DNA that you can recover from a sample and do anything with it. You know, right now, 50,000 years. That's it. It's about as old, which is kind of convenient. It's about as old as reliable carbon dating is. And that gives you a really good opportunity, since carbon dating is so good now, to what people have been doing recently, which has really blown my mind and has blown the topic of world history off its axis, is the ability to kind of go back you're doing a time machine thing. You can go to ancient burial, where you've got carbon dating that nails down within a couple of hundred years when that dead body was stuck in the ground. And you can get a sample from the inner ear of a skull, and with some good modern techniques, get a really good sample of DNA from that. And you can get the entire genome from that individual now. This is all happening in the last 6 years. All happening in the last 10 years. All these refined techniques, the ability to get fine-scale genetic material from a skeleton and get the entire genome, not just the mitochondrial gene or a single gene, but all the genetic material from that individual. Yeah. Now, remember, in 2000, we sequenced the first human genome.
Right.
That was 22 years ago, right? It was a big deal then. Now we're getting the entire genome from individuals from like a Hun burial from 200 AD. And we're getting an entire genome from an individual from 3,000 years ago at Stonehenge. And we're able to finally answer some of these historical questions, right? Because world history is great. It's rich. It's full of drama. But the problem is it doesn't cover all of our, all the stories, because there's a lot of prehistory that is the realm of archaeology. And so there's all these crazy things that happen, and we've just never been able to quite tell who are these people that are doing these things in prehistory, because there's no written record.
Yeah, and we should mention, too, you talked about how fast this has advanced.
Yeah.
From my little bit of research that I've done over the past couple of days, and just sort of keeping an eye on advancements in paleoanthropology and all of that, like there could be a paper out tomorrow about a newer and older skeleton that's been discovered with DNA. So for our listeners, if you're trying to keep up with this, it's really, really fast paced.
So what this really does is it means if you read a history book that was published 10, 15 years ago, it's already out of date. Okay. All that you know about prehistory of Europe, of North America, all those books that you grew up with, it's the same way, like if you were to take a book about the solar system that was written in 1979, it would have a picture of Pluto, and it would be this fuzzy, crappy, digitized, pixelated picture of Pluto, and we have no idea what Pluto's like. But we've been to Pluto now with a probe. Like, you can't read a book from the 70s about solar system. It's completely out of date.
Right.
That's happening right now with world history
So
because of ancient DNA.
okay, so when we say ancient DNA, let's put numbers on this one. So
Okay. I remember back when I was just a little tadpole.
oh yes. So because Thomas does paleontology and he tries to see if there is DNA. We are not talking about the DNAs in dinosaurs and stuff like that. Trying to
No,
find that.
can't do that. Nope.
So we can do that, can't do that. So can we do the earliest hominids that we know about, which came like 1 million years ago?
Can't do that either.
Can't do that either.
Right
So-
now, because those it's really comes down to, so when a skeleton goes in the ground and if it becomes mineralized and
Okay.
becomes a true fossil, then the DNA is going to be gone.
Okay.
Right? It won't survive that. But what we're talking about are remains that aren't quite really even fossils. These are actual skeletons in the ground that haven't changed or become super mineralized yet.
Okay.
And so they still contain some of the proteins in the bone, because living bone is not just minerals. It's got living stuff in it. And so, and that's why these don't go much older than, say, 10,000 years. But look, a lot of cool things have happened in the last 10,000 years, a lot of which have been totally mysterious, and we're revealing incredible things about just the last 10,000 years. That's since the last ice age. And
Okay.
some of these samples go back farther than that. I think the oldest one is like 25, somewhere around 50,000 BC. So during the middle of the ice age, or during the end of the ice age, and younger. We've got that. And so there's, yeah.
No, sorry, I'm interrupting you. So my question now becomes is like, so the idea, if it does not mineralize, so you're saying Jurassic Park can still happen, right? Is that what I'm hearing?
Not the way that they show it in Jurassic Park.
But so if we have somehow, we have a fly somehow preserved that is not mineralized, is there any way it can happen? Is there any...
No,
Okay.
like
DNA will break down.
Even a mosquito in amber is not going to have. And you know, the original idea for Jurassic Park came from an old. This goes into the story, because there is an old paper from like the 80s where somebody tried to sequence a protein from a dinosaur bone, and they got a sequence and they published it, and it was a big deal. And that probably got Michael Crichton thinking about, oh, could we get DNA from ancient specimens? And it got everybody thinking about that. But the problem was, what they really sequenced was their own tissue. It was a contaminated sample. And that they published it. It basically said, here's a fragment of DNA, and it's from a tyrannosaur, but it's actually from my own thumb. Now, that still happens. And it's been happening. Like, one of the reasons why this is all kind of coming out now, because we've had the ability to sequence the genome since 2000, but only now are we getting this incredible amount of information. Part of it is because it's becoming super cheap. And so really good labs that are well funded can do this really easily now. The other thing is they've solved a lot of those contamination problems. And so now they're pretty sure when they get a sample from a 10,000-year-old skeleton that it's the person that, you know, whose cranium that belonged to, and not their own, or from a bacteria, or from a piece of, you know, dandelion that flew into the bone, right? So the contamination problem is solved. The price problem is solved, and now giddy up,
Giddy up.
because it's getting out of control. It's
we will have
blowing up world history. And I keep saying world history, and I mean history in kind of a larger sense of like what happened in the past, because really what we're talking about is amazing things that happened in prehistory, but in pretty recent prehistory, the last 10,000 years since the last ice age.
Well, that's when things really got interesting for humans
Right.
I mean,
as a species.
And there's
because
so many cool things that happened that nobody was around to write. So we got really good archaeological record of some of these things, but still we don't know who these people were. We don't know where they came from in many cases. Maybe I should just give you guys a taste of the kinds of things that we're starting to figure out.
Like a little morsel. A nice little.
one DNA strand.
It's clean our cranial palates right now.
All right, so you guys have heard of the Huns.
Yes.
Attila the Hun.
Yeah, that's all
Right?
the Hun. Yeah.
And he rolls into Europe in the early, around the 300 mark AD, right? Middle, at the time the Western Roman Empire was a thing, and Europe, Germany, France was like an outpost of the Western Roman Empire, and all of a sudden these dudes come in from the steppes, on horses and just clean up Europe, right? They fight like no one's ever seen. They came out of nowhere. They did a lot of destroying. They weren't super nice people, right? And people have always wondered where the hell they came from, who they, what their ancestry were. Now, flash back about, a good 600 years before then, around 300 BC or to 100 BC in China, steppe warriors came and were totally screwing with China, with the Han Dynasty, destroying, very similar, right? And, the Han Dynasty, some of the first of the great walls that were built were to help, with outposts against these nomads from the steppes who came and were ravaging China. And, a historian posited, he had a hypothesis that the Xiongnu, who were attacking Han China, and the Huns, a couple hundred years later, were the same people. They just kind of disappeared from the historical record in Central Asia after the Han Dynasty were able to fight them off. And then they reappear in Europe a couple hundred years later as the Huns. The evidence for this was very flimsy. It was just like a historical kind of, coincidence that they happened around the same time. There's very little linguistic evidence. Yeah. We literally have the names of like 3 of these dudes from Europe that anybody wrote down. One of them was Attila. And then they just kind of vanish from the historical record after Attila the Hun dies. He dies, and there's, the typical steppe nomad grasping for the reins of power. It dissolves, and they're gone. Well, we have burials from the Xiongnu in China. We have burials from the Huns in Europe. And genetically, they're the same people. Boom! Right there. Yep. The old hypothesis that some professor was able to kind of think up, maybe I can't remember when it was, but it's now fairly well confirmed. The Xiongnu and the Huns were the same people. That right there is just nuts. Like for people who love this kind of great, the military history of Europe, and this is just, it's a delicious snack to eat, to know finally that the Xiongnu and the Huns were the same.
Now, Sean, do you know, are there remnants of Hun DNA and people in Europe?
And modern people.
Modern
a little
people?
bit. And they were kind of, they're still around. And, modern Europeans are such a mix. It's hard to trace any of this stuff. But I wouldn't doubt it if in the future they will have little genetic markers where you can test for specific things like that in your own DNA.
So
there's already, when you get on Ancestry.com right now, it's pretty coarse. You're like, well, you're 35% Iberian, 45% Central Asian, that kind of thing. But I bet in the future, there'll be specific markers where you'll be able to look and see how much Hun do I have. But right now, that stuff's not there. And part of the problem has been, the story is changing a lot. If you've been following this, and you might have read a lot about ancient humans from stuff that was published in the 90s. And what they've been trying to do so far is try to piece together these stories using only modern human DNA, right? And that gives you a slightly different story because modern humans are mixed up.
Yeah, super diluted.
If you go back 8,000 years ago, the story is a lot different. And so that's really what's going on now, because the first attempts to reconstruct the history of humans, coming out of Africa, populating Europe and Australia, that was all based on modern humans only. Now we're getting kind of a step-by-step time machine approach using ancient DNA. And the story is becoming much more nuanced, much more interesting.
I think one thing I've kind of run into when reading about all this is this notion that we've had historically that I'm not going to say early humans, but ancient human civilizations, Stone Age, Iron Age humans, were provincial. I think we know in whatever written history we have that there was some, exchange, but we think of sort of these tribalist societies and people sort of sequestered in their own groups. But even going back to the Stone Age, I discovered some papers that showed that there was a lot more mixing going on than
and a lot more
we
movement,
previously.
Right?
Yeah, a lot more movement and mixing going on.
Yeah. that's kind of one of the biggest take-home messages from all these recent stories and papers, is that there apparently in archaeology there had been this tendency or this dichotomy where anybody who said, look, this new group that appears on the scene on this horizon in our soil sample, we think they migrated from 400 miles away and just appeared out of nowhere. Archaeologists would have poo-pooed that idea just 50 years ago, 20 years ago even. They'd say, no, there's no reason to expect why people would have migrated any long distance. No, they probably just developed into these new people, gradually on their own in place, and they didn't move much. That whole dichotomy between provincialism, like you mentioned, or mass movements has been completely skewed towards mass movements.
Yep.
Mainly because of these genetic samples. One of the biggest discoveries in the last 5 years, and it's only been 5 years, is that in Europe, the idea was that there was a mass migration of people into Europe from the Near East when the first farmers moved from the Near East, where farming was more or less first invented, and moved into Europe and took it with them. And the first genetic evidence, of course, the first ideas about this were that they probably just moved the technology, and the people didn't actually change much. Well, that's been shot down completely. Turns out the farmers largely displaced most of the hunter-gatherers that were in Europe at the time. They did do some interbreeding because those early hunter-gatherers, the genetic material for those folks is still in modern Europeans, small percentages. But there was a ton of population displacement. But that was pretty much assumed to be the only mass migration of people into Europe, was this migration of farmers, which makes sense. I mean, that you can't really think of where else would anybody have came from. But it turned out, if you look a little, so that was all done by about 6,000 years ago, right? Around the time Stonehenge was built.
7, yeah.
Was later, right? But so farmers in Britain. But then a couple thousand years later, another group appears in Europe. And genetically, modern Europeans have this huge section of their genome that's from this other group. And they had to kind of search around and where the hell do these people come from? They finally nailed it down. Turns out an archaeologist had already kind of shown that this happened using just archaeology and linguistics, the appearance of the Indo-European languages into Europe. And he pretty much figured out that, the first people who domesticated the horse and came up with wheeled carriages rolled into Europe, brought early Indo-European languages with them. And that happened in the Bronze Age, not very recently, 3,000 years ago or something like that. My dates are probably all over the place because I don't deal with numbers. Anyway, so they go looking for this third population, and they find them in this archaeological region that this fella had already identified in this amazing book called The Horse, the Wheel, and Language. And there's this Yamnaya horizon that's around the kind of steppes between the Black Sea and the Caspian.
The Caucasus Mountains.
Right, in that area, and mostly in the steppes. And they went two directions. They went into Europe, and they went in, to the east as far as like the Tarim Basin in China, and to the Indian subcontinent. That's why this is something that historians have been struggling with for 200 years. Why do people in the Indian subcontinent and Europe share a language family, the Indo-European language family? Boom. The Yamnaya steppe people, first people to come up with horses and wheeled vehicles. They were a warlike people. It was pretty much the first steppe invasion. And they moved both directions and changed world history. And all that has been tied up now with genetic evidence.
Yeah.
So, a 200-year-old hypothesis from a linguist, a book that came out 2008 that was just prehistoric archaeology. And, what happened is the fellow who wrote that book, David Anthony, was approached by David Reich, who is an ancient DNA specialist, and said, let's test your hypothesis. And they did. And it worked out. That's where that other third group of Europeans came from the steppes.
It's a really cool marriage of traditional archaeology and paleogenomics and I think the coolest thing to come out of that, just looking at it in terms of the cultural exchange, is, when new populations enter an area that's already populated, there's really only a couple of things that can happen. They either fight and rape and pillage or kill off the existing population, or they share their technology and commerce begins. And we have
Trade.
examples of all of that in the just traditional archaeological record that we have,
Right.
and to confirm that with genetics is really neat.
And
Yeah, or two things could happen, or all of the above, right?
Yeah, true.
So you always hear people in archaeology, since it's a weird science that's kind of married to a humanities, anthropology. They get a little. There's a little political correctness that goes on, and there has been, and the tendency is always, even in the horse, the wheel, and language. It's funny because the archaeologist is like, yeah, what probably happened is that the Yamna moved into Europe, and they were, enforcing this kind of client subject relationship with the locals, and that's how it spread. And flash forward just 10 years, and they find out that in Britain, when these steppe people showed up, there was a 90% population replacement.
Wow.
90%.
Yeah, that's not
farmers,
through gentle sharing of technology.
I don't think so.
No.
I don't. You can try to make it. You can try to put that round peg in a square hole, but it's probably what happened when cavalry first showed up in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
It wasn't client. It wasn't this. It was the Spanish arrived in North America with horses, and the technology was there, and it was not good news for the people who were.
No.
And we've seen this a million times.
Yeah, and weapons and diseases.
It's pretty interesting that in just 10 years, even the archaeologists who figured this all out based on archaeological evidence had to kind of change his tune. There's some evidence that they might have brought the first Black Plague to Europe, and that helped with the 90% population replacement. It wasn't just murder constantly.
Yeah.
It could have been the old story of new diseases, which we've heard a million times too.
Well, we got to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll continue with ancient DNA.
hello, everybody. So we are back, and we are talking about ancient DNA now. So on the last segment when we ended before the break, we were talking about, and you said that 10% of the original population survived and 90% was replaced by these new, let's say what they are, like
Nomadic
invaders.
tribes.
Invaders.
Yeah.
Well, nomadic tribes. I mean, they're everywhere, right?
Yeah, we were invading. So
That's how we got to do it,
yeah,
baby.
yeah, it's
I'll say it. Okay, we're invading.
invading.
Just like the first farmers who came to Britain were invading too.
yeah.
Like our
Came across
ancient
the-
ancestors in
yeah.
America.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I mean,
There's a lot of movement.
and the same steps people that you're talking about also, let's say, invaded India too, but in India it becomes a little bit sketchy because the problem is we didn't really have, but we will come to, I was going to come to that later, but you said 10% were what remained. Now, how do you know the 10%? Like, where does this 10%, is there like a certain tribe of British people, the royal family, who are the 10% we are talking about?
Vampires. Vampires.
I think some of the confusion might be coming from the idea that what you're picturing is like in modern British people, what percent is left, and we're not even looking at that because this is based on a talk I've seen and some papers I've read from Robert Reich's lab from Harvard. And so what he's got is remember, these are all really well dated skeletons, and so he's got this incredible graph where it's just like a timeline from about 3500 BC or something like that, around the time just before Stonehenge, right up to when Stonehenge was built, and then right after. And that right after is supposed to be around the time when the steppe invasion happened in Britain. It happened all over Europe at different times. And with such good time control because of carbon dating, you can look at this invasion at multiple places in Europe and see what happened in every case. And so you can compare the genetic material of the people right before and right after, and what you see is a 90% replacement.
okay.
The amount of genetic material. Not necessarily modern people in Britain don't necessarily show that same percentage because 3,500 years have gone by and more mixing has occurred since then. And that's what's so beautiful about these new data is they're snapshots of exactly an incredible, like, who wouldn't want to know exactly what's going on and who's around when Stonehenge was built? Right?
Yeah,
That's
one of the
so-
papers I read compared it to the black box of history, sort of secret message locked away that we can decode now.
Exactly. That's a good way to put it. So that's what we're talking about. Of course, since then, more of the people with ancestry from the Near East kind of went back and mixed more with those steppe people in the ensuing 2,000 years. And so now Europeans are a real mix of basically, I think, 4 source populations that 8,000 years ago were super, super different from each other. There were 2 hunter-gatherer groups, one in Western Europe, one in Eastern. There were the Near Eastern farmers, and then the steppe people. Those are the 4 big populations that were super genetically different from each other 8,000 years ago that have now coalesced into modern Europeans. And so every modern European is a super mix of all 4 of those populations. And you need, I mean, if you had enough money, you could find out exactly what the breaks are for you. And of course, you could kind of guess it by looking at some of the maps that they produce. Like, the steppe invasion people, there's basically no pure examples of any of those 4 populations left. The closest thing we have to the Near East farmers are modern Sardinians.
Okay.
Because they basically colonized Sardinia, an island, and they've remained there, ever since, and were able to kind of withstand invasions from other people ever since. And so they've just been chilling there, safe on the island. And I think the highest proportion of steppe ancestry is in like Northern Europe, so Scandinavian, that kind of thing.
That makes sense.
But there's no pure mix. There's no pure people of those 4 populations. All modern Europeans are just a super mix of them.
And then, like the one that you talked about, the linguistic resemblance between the Indian language. By Indian, we should also clarify when we say the Indo-European, we are actually talking about the entire Persia. We are talking about Iran, Iraq, India, the entire branch we are talking about, and we are comparing them to the entire branch of Europe. So basically, we're saying that they all had a common root origin of our language, like,
Right.
and that has been
it's a huge language family that includes an incredible number of languages. All the Celtic languages, the Germanic languages, of which English is one.
The Romance
languages in the Middle East, and the northern Middle East, because the more southern Middle East, Arabia, places like that, have like another branch to the Semitic languages.
Yeah.
So all kinds. I mean, it's a huge language family, and people have known for a while that they're suspiciously similar, and now we have a really good reason of why they would be.
Yeah, linguistically, it has been well studied that those branches of languages are very similar because Latin and Sanskrit have the very similar roots in their languages, and they're very two different places completely. How can that happen? Obviously, they came together at one point somehow. The origin was there. So
the spread.
The spread. And this ancient DNA also kind of then now brings since close. When you said they came out of steppes, there has to be a secondary migration, right? Because when we talking about because one of the first human civilization, if you think about, kind of happened in the Tigris, Euphrates belt.
Yeah, and the Fertile Crescent.
Fertile Crescent.
Mesopotamia.
That's where pretty much things get going, right? And
that's where agriculture gets going.
Yeah,
and presumably not far behind agriculture. And I should say it's the first place where agriculture got going, right? Because agriculture got going multiple places in different times, but the very first time anywhere, as far as we know.
Yeah.
Mesopotamia.
Yeah. And then those are the farmers you're saying what the first wave of migration who moved into Europe?
Into Europe, yeah.
So,
and that happened over a couple thousand years.
Yeah.
They brought wheat agriculture, they brought cows and other domestic animals. Now, these Yamnaya steppe people were not agriculturalists.
No.
So what really caused them to take off, and they may not even have been the first people to domesticate the horse. They were close. what they did is there was some innovations going on in the steppe at the time. Horse domestication, maybe at first for just meat. They were just herding horses for meat, and then somebody had the bright idea to jump on one and ride it. But horse riding, they may not have even invented that. They may not have even invented the wheel. But what they did is they took those kinds of innovations, put them together. The first thing they did was they were basically the first people to fully exploit the grasslands of Eurasia, the steppes. So everybody before then had basically stuck to river valleys, where they could herd cows and goats and maybe do a little farming, right?
Yeah.
These people, when they got the horse and the wheel, they took off onto the steppe and never looked back. They could herd their animals, and they could go hundreds of miles out into the steppe, and nobody could find them out there. They could appear out of nowhere, right? And so once they had full control of the steppe, then they started moving into places that were already settled by farmers and really changing up things. It's the first steppe invasion, right there. And we started this talking about the Huns, which is like a middle steppe invasion, right? So there's just been this incredible, pattern in world history of people coming out of the steppes and changing the game. And it turns out that the first steppe invasion happened in prehistory, when nobody was even around to write it, and nobody even remembered it by the time the Huns came in, right? The people in Europe who were afraid of the Huns didn't even realize that they were kind of related to the Huns.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
I'm sure there was some stories passed down, it's like the boogeyman that lives out in the
Could
in the
be,
steppes.
yeah. But it happened so long ago, nobody remembered. Right? And then the Mongols were a even later example, right?
Yeah.
The Mongols came out of nowhere in the 1200s and changed the game again.
But they were like 100% diplomats. They just
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's the modern anthropological analysis. is that
Well,
they were good traders, and they were.
yeah.
No, I mean they tried diplomacy, right? Come on, they
were, yeah.
they tried. They said they said like if you don't surrender, we are going to kill everybody and
we're
nail
gonna
you to the wall.
chop your heads off.
If you surrender, we will leave you alone. So I think that's a good
They
diplomacy.
did. That's 100% right, because I don't think they could have taken over such a huge empire without. There was a lot of that.
Yeah.
They're wanting tribute more than they want corpses.
Yeah.
They want riches. You give us all this, and you ride under our banner. And they gained armies that way. So
we have
it's
genetic
amazing.
evidence that they didn't just murder everyone, because
Right.
1 out of 10
exactly.
Europeans, I think, are what like
a little bit of Genghis Khan.
A little bit of con in there.
So, so coming back to this now, I'm assuming as we go down the line, we are going to do more of this analysis in the places because we are right now focused on just the European bits, and I'm assuming we're also going to start. People are going to start looking deep into Egypt, right, and how that happened and how the migrations happened.
I imagine there'll be some amazing stuff, and I should point out, like Robert Reich, who's really kind of taken this and run with it, is quick to point out that the reason why there's a lot of stuff going on in Europe right now is not because Europe is the center of the world. It's that Europe has an incredible and very accessible museum set of bones, right? It should be said, a lot of these analyses, nobody's going into old tombs and grabbing bones and sampling them. Pretty much all of this stuff is happening with bones that are already in museums and well cataloged and well dated. So it's easy for Robert Reich has probably never been to an archaeological site. He's just up in Harvard, and people are sending him samples that are already really well described, and they know who these people are, and they know where they found them, and they know how old they are. But what they don't know is who the people are genetically, and so he just tells them that, and they put together the story. And so it's all museum-based stuff mostly. But you're right, this is going to expand out. It's expanded into North America in a really interesting way. And when it expands into North America, some interesting politics are going to be involved. Do we have time to talk about this now, Conley, or should we wait?
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes. But before we get into that, I do have a question. You kind of triggered a question. In 1956, there was a film out during the big John Wayne era. It was called The Conqueror. where John Wayne played Genghis Khan.
Yeah.
Genghis
And
Khan.
the number one logical choice to play Genghis
Yes,
Khan.
I mean,
So was that more accurate? Because I remember the woke mob came out and they were like, "Oh,
Yeah.
this is awful. You
yeah,
can't
he,
do this."
he would have been totally canceled. He doesn't change his voice at all.
I
either.
tripped on myself a little bit. Because the original steppe people that rolled into Europe
Yeah.
were probably they probably didn't look like Mongols or Huns. So their genetic affiliation is from this interesting old North Eurasian population who probably looked like, what we conceive of as Caucasian or white people, right? So the Yamnaya people who moved west and east were probably people who looked fairly Caucasian. And the Mongols and Huns were definitely kind of more of like the East Asian. Now, a lot of that East Asian looking, genetic material moved into the steppe, later than the Yamnaya population.
Now,
Does
when
that
you
make
say
sense?
East Asian, I'm thinking like a
Chinese.
cross between Russian
No.
and Chinese like
Just-
folks.
I mean like Chinese, Korean, Japanese.
Chinese,
yeah.
Japanese.
So
yeah.
it looks like about 10,000, 8,000 up to like 5,000 years ago in the northern steppes, Siberia, people probably looked a lot like Eurasians, or I'm sorry, like Europeans looked. now.
Yeah, and
There was a later kind of movement of more of the East Asian genetic material after that, which is why modern Siberians, right, look like Native Americans.
yeah, and
Right. And so they all kind of that all kind of happened pretty recently. And so I mentioned that the Yamnaya and the Europeans, when the Huns showed up, they would say, "Oh wow," they wouldn't even know that they were kind of related. We're all pretty related, but in terms of looks and things, it wasn't quite like that.
and also like it has been fairly with the
So
last.
John Wayne was a bad choice for the
Yeah.
role.
Okay, all right, okay. Well, you
Yeah,
answered my question.
Watch a clip of that. It's really pretty funny because
Yeah,
he
the
doesn't change his
conqueror.
voice.
He doesn't. He does the same.
I'm Genghis Khan, and I'm here to conquer your lands.
partner.
Y'all,
exactly
That's really good.
conquer y'all
That's really
lands
Conquer y'all's lands.
and
Them there lands out there.
yeah. I was going to say, like, one of the things is very obvious within the last 10, 15 years. Like, there's also the genetic studies which prove, like, Indian subcontinent is very much related to the Eurasians rather than having their own kind of, like, it's the same story of what that has happened. Like, and we do have certain tribal areas where we have a very distinct kind of, own DNA, which is very different from what the DNA of the people, usual crowd of Indians would be. But again, it's also very interesting to see because India has been invaded multiple times over years.
Right.
And there has been
that's something that is coming out from this. That there's been people have noticed that there seem to be little enclaves of people scattered around the world that represent kind of older populations of humans that didn't get mixed as much.
Yeah.
And so you think about like Aboriginal Australians, New Guinea, there are these Melanesians and other, like some of those island populations in the Philippines where people look like Aboriginal Australians instead of Filipinos.
Yes.
And that kind of thing. And genetically we're kind of, and this happened in Africa too.
Yeah.
Africans, the San people in South Africa look very different from folks in West and East Africa. And there's all this great genetic evidence of these migrations of people that get agriculture
Yeah.
that swamp the existing hunter-gatherers.
Yeah. And
That happened in Africa with the Bantu expansion.
Bantu expansion, that's what
It
I was going
happened.
to say.
It happened in Central America when the Uto Aztecans, carried that language family into North America. It happened in East Asia when Asian agriculturalists spread from there across, South Asia, even out into the Polynesian islands.
Yeah.
So this has happened multiple times. And now we have really good genetic evidence to couple with the limited archaeological evidence and kind of linguistic evidence that was available.
Yeah, one thing that just came to mind talking about these genetic studies is looking at it from sort of a paleontological standpoint. There's this concept of preservation bias. And I'm wondering if another reason we have such a good record in Europe and this whole region that we've been talking about is because people were burying they're dead, because I know a lot of these
Yeah.
skeletons were collected from essentially burial grounds or cemeteries, and
Yeah.
there are a lot of civilizations that have existed that burned their dead or did something else with the bodies. So I'm wondering if there's going to be some sort of preservation bias issue when this really, really continues to explode, and we start looking in other places.
That's something they're going to have to keep in mind for sure.
Yeah.
And of course, it's going to be you won't be able to do it if you can't find the samples. So we'll need archaeologists. We'll need those museum collections to tell these stories.
Yeah. Well, I think we got another break coming up.
Yep.
In our last segment after this, so we'll see y'all back in a couple of minutes.
All right.
All right, we're back. We're the Science Knights. We're talking about ancient DNA. Now, Sean, something that I guess historically has been a controversial issue, I guess, is maybe associating phenotypes, the physical characteristics of different populations, to their origins, and maybe delving into how different populations mixed historically, and
humans.
human populations. And this is the way we go about looking at other animals and even extinct animals, things that are fossilized. We look at their physical characteristics, and we try and surmise what their evolutionary history is like, and also their provinciality and how they've migrated and all that. So why not do it with humans? But for obvious reasons, it's been sort of a controversial topic. But has this sort of revolution in paleogenomics helped to bring this more onto the scientific end of the spectrum?
Yeah, that's exactly what's going on. People are talking about those kinds of features again. And, if you look at a textbook in anthropology 100 years ago, it's full of descriptions of, facial patterns from skeletons where they're able to figure out, using just like facial bones and things like that, basic similarities and differences among humans. Mm-hmm. And then, a period of time through the 40s, 50s, 60s, that became very kind of taboo to talk about.
Yeah.
Because, Nazis used those same kinds of terms for their ends, and it got really ugly. And, people just kind of ignored it for a while, and it was like a skeleton in the closet. But now it's kind of coming out again, because we can marry it to genetic material. And as long as you use very precise words, we've totally thrown away the word race. We don't even use it anymore. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make any sense. And you just use the word population for different groups of people.
Yeah.
And you can, and if you're more careful about it than they were in the 30s, right, you can get an amazing story. And that stuff is coming back. And one good example of this, and we'll bring it to North America, some of the earliest fossil or skeletons of humans in North America had, this is known for a long time, and it became quiet for a long time, that a lot of those early skulls looked fairly Caucasian to the anthropologists. Mm-hmm. And they've always kind of racked their head and wondered what the hell that's all about. And now that we know that, we have this genetic information that shows that modern Europeans and Native Americans actually share genetic material from a source population that was in North Eurasia, in Siberia, mm-hmm. about 15,000 years ago. And so if 15,000 years ago, there was this population of people in Siberia that, some of them moved west and eventually became the Yamnaya and then took over Europe. Some of them, about 10,000 years ago, moved into North America and were one of the populations that populated North America and South America. Mm-hmm. So that there's this amazing genetic link between Europeans and Native Americans that the skulls actually told us a long time ago that we kind of forgot and ignored for a while. And now that idea is coming back, and it's very interesting. North America is going to be a very interesting place to use this new technology.
Yeah, because we do have burials, and we do have older material that's sitting in museums that we could be age dated.
And what I hinted at in the last segment is it's going to become interesting and difficult to work in North America, probably more than any other place in the world. And it's not because of a lack of an archaeological record, not because of a lack of technology or scientific curiosity. It's going to be because it's difficult to get permission
Right.
to ethically work with Native American skeletons. And you can probably imagine why. There's actually a federal law where the 1990, the movement of trying to kind of treat Native American skeletons with more respect and maybe even repatriate them, get them out of museums and get them buried the proper way that Native Americans want those bones, their ancestors, to be handled. So this has already blown up. Robert Reich stepped on his own shoes. He got approached by a group that had great skeletons from Chaco Canyon, right up the road in New Mexico. And they wrote a paper that is totally mind-blowing, and it's rewriting the history of the ancient Southwest, and it's unbelievable. And instead of being celebrated for the incredible find that it was attacked for being unethical. So what they found is unbelievable. So Chaco... Yeah, sorry.
No,
Go ahead.
sorry.
I might be getting ahead of myself.
No, this Chaco Canyon, but you are saying that tribes who live there are they are the ones who approached Robert Reich, right?
No. So the archaeologists, that's great. I'm glad you're making me hammer this out. So
Okay.
archaeologists who are familiar with Chaco Canyon are white people, right?
Okay.
And so they and it's a National Historic Site. So it's federal land.
Okay.
The skeletons are in the American Museum of Natural History and were dug up by dudes 100 years ago.
Who didn't care at all.
Yeah. And the people, so the damage, the crime was done, right? They grabbed the skeletons, they were put in boxes, shipped to New York. So the Chaco Canyon is an amazing site. It's these huge stone palaces. And one of the questions has always been, and anthropologists have been fighting over this for decades, are these just simple pueblos where farmers built pueblos like modern pueblos, or are these like palaces where elites lived and they were like kings? And there's really good archaeological evidence that that's the case, because there's these palaces and then it looks like commoners lived near the fields, right?
Wow.
And they brought in wooden beams from 50 miles away, and those were probably not carried by the people who lived in those palaces, right? But our anthropologists, their tendency is to think about egalitarianism, and they're like, no, probably. Well, they sequenced people who lived in the richest burials in Chaco Canyon and found that those people were part of a ruling dynasty that lived at Chaco Canyon for 330 years.
Wow.
They were genetically identical on their mitochondrial genome, which is passed by mom. So it was a matrilineal descent of Chacoan kings. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It probably sounds counterintuitive because you're thinking a matrilineal descent means matriarchal. No, you can have a patriarchal matriline. Does that make sense? Where okay. I don't know exactly how that works, but the descent system in many of the Native American cultures was matrilineal descent, but they still had kings, right? So that's
like
what
the
happened
Jewish
to
people, right? Like if you have the Jewish people, also the religion comes from the mother, right? It doesn't come from the father. The mom.
Well, this is genetic material.
No, I'm talking about like kind of like that. Like as Sean's talking about, like the king is a man, but to be a part of the tribe, you have to come from the mother. If you think about it in terms of Jewish religion, the religion comes from the mother, but the ruler is a man.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Like I'm talking about that one.
There you go.
Yeah.
And so this is all from the analysis of a bunch of skeletons in Chaco Canyon. And like I said, instead of everybody's mind being blown, holy cow, this is solving an ancient Southwestern mystery, instead the group was attacked for unethical use of the skeletons because supposedly it's iffy, right? Because their foundation for using the skeletons was that those skeletons were unassigned, and it was impossible to know which modern Native American group they belonged to. And that was true. And so they went ahead and did it anyway. And now that they know, they probably, this is actually supporting the case that the Chacoans were probably the ancestors of modern Hopis, because they show a matrilineal descent system.
Yeah, and there's so many mysteries in North American native.
And this could have been like oh wow, they helped to show a link between Chaco and modern Hopis. but instead it became a total political hot potato. So this is what, unfortunately, for North American and people who are interested in Native American archaeology, I think the story is going to come slow for fans of Southwestern archaeology, fans of American archaeology. Everywhere else in the world is going to go really fast, and it's going to be mind-blowing. So you might want to become a fan of Eurasian prehistory right now, because you'll have to wait a little bit longer, because it's gonna what really it's going to have to take, and which will be a good thing, is going to be really good collaboration between Native Americans, modern Native Americans, and archaeologists.
Yeah. Well,
And that has been a long time coming, and it is coming, but it's coming slow.
yeah. Well, it's going to be a hard pill to swallow for both those indigenous people and the archaeologists who are helping to do the work, because if it's true that there was a lot more sort of European influence, then
That brings in an interesting question, doesn't it? That came up with the discovery of a really old skull in Washington State.
Oh yeah,
What they called Kennewick Man.
I've heard of that.
Because
Yeah.
the skull looked Caucasian, the archaeologist used that as he said, "Look, this thing isn't even Native American, so we're going to sample it." And it became an absolute poop storm.
Oh boy.
That became a huge political plot. So even when, the other thing, so think about this: the Navajo, who live in northern Arizona currently, also claim Chaco Canyon as very significant to them, and they weren't. All the archaeological evidence suggests that they weren't even there when Chaco Canyon was built. It's not theirs, and only archaeological evidence can show that. Right?
Yeah.
So if Navajo said we want Chaco Canyon because it's ours, and the archaeological evidence says hell no, you guys arrived in a huge mass migration from Alaska, in the last 400 or 500 years. What do you do then?
Yeah. Well,
The Navajo are a very big, very politically active tribe.
Well, the other side of that coin is like what we talked about with the steppe invasions. Is we're talking about a scale of hundreds and hundreds of years. They could have controlled that
Right.
region at some point in time. That's not preserved in the
interesting, 'cause
archaeological record.
Certainly, the Navajo, even though they're recent arrivals, have been around for longer than we have.
I mean,
Yeah.
Even let's forget, and it's going to also rile a lot of people in mainland Europe who are believers of our fatherland, of their that's their problem, because they don't want to be associated
That's why,
with
yeah,
That's
on
totally
one
been
hand-
dispelled already.
Yeah, I mean, they still think that there is something going on, but it's becoming very clear that no, you are still a mixture of a bunch of people. There is nothing pure.
It's just
about,
an older mixture.
Yeah,
This is a great. Maybe this would be a good thing to end on, because that's 100% right. Like, on one hand, this stuff seems a little. It makes you wince a little bit when you talk about ancient populations. You're like, oh my god, are we gonna get the skinheads to latch on to this stuff in weird ways that were unexpected? And people have already written about that.
Yeah.
Some of these weird, fringe dark web groups are taking these papers and going, oh, see, we're the original cordware people who stepped in. It's like, man, it takes some serious mental gymnastics to come to that conclusion.
Yeah.
I guess I'll end on, this is great. That Western hunter-gatherer group that was in Europe, the farmers came in on, some of the first examples of modern humans in modern Britain, or in Britain, like 8,000 BC, black with blue eyes.
That's cool.
And that their ancestry is in everybody but Honorbot.
Aw.
Well, that's the thing. If you
I feel left out. I feel left out. I'm like, how did we not get that
Yeah,
one?
well,
Since we got everybody
Yeah,
invading
you
us.
guys-
I to think
had
about
war
it. I had to
elephants
think
that you
about it.
could-
I'm pretty
Oh,
sure,
sure.
unless there's some like British in you from the colonial period, I don't think you would have any of that, because Conley, me, and Thomas are European as hell, and so we probably have some of that hunter-gatherer in us.
Yeah, I think where we come down is basically the steppes invasion. Like, that's where the common unifying
Yeah, that's
factor.
where we
Yeah.
are all pretty similar because of that.
Yeah.
And that maybe should be the take-home message for everybody, is this all happened in the last 10,000 years. There used to be very distinctive groups of humans genetically, And over the last 1,000 years, most of those genetic differences have gone away.
Yeah.
We're all one big happy human family.
Yeah.
And then what we can look forward to the future, and I want to end this one, that, Sean, I want to know, can we bring back mammoths and saber-toothed tigers back? Because we have their
Yes.
flesh and everything, right?
Yes.
So we can bring
I
them
think-
back.
So if we want to bring it back to cloning, like
Yes.
we have the technology right now. If we didn't have any ethical scruples, we could clone one of these Yamnia people to find out what they look like. And so if you can get the whole genome and you have a surrogate mother, and
I don't think we want to talk about that. It
So
just
with-
feels,
with the mammoth, what you'd need is a surrogate mother. That's tough, but you could use an African elephant. So
yeah.
that's probably possible.
Yeah.
Siberian tiger or the saber tooth, if we could find the DNA, could probably use a modern lion to be the surrogate mother. It'd probably work. But those are the two things you need. And otherwise it becomes really, really difficult.
Okay.
And so you need the whole genome and a surrogate mother.
And no ethics.
Yeah, zero
And
ethics.
Ethics.
No
Zero
ethics at all.
ethics,
You
yeah.
need zero ethics at all.
So now we know what's going to happen in the future. We're going to eliminate all of our ethics.
Yes.
And we're just going to put our nose to the grindstone.
Yep.
And maybe one day we will all kind of look like the same little people. Who knows? You think will that ever happen, Sean?
We're all going to look like Honorbun.
We're all
We're
going to
all
be
going to
little.
look like, I fast forward 200 years, we're all going to look like Brazilians.
Yeah.
It's going to be awesome.
Brazilians or Indians? I mean,
All
that's
right.
the biggest
Can we
mixture.
invent a time machine already?
Brazilians, yeah, exactly. I want to get there as fast
Not.
as possible.
I have been to Brazil. Yes, the beach is extremely filled with good-looking people, but not on the streets. There is a misconception there.
Sorry, any Brazilian people who are listening right
Hey,
now.
I give the compliment. It's filled with beautiful people on the beach.
Yeah.
Well, there's something for me to write in my diary before I go to sleep tonight. So, all right. Thanks, everybody. This has been another great episode of Science Nights in the Morning. We'll catch you next week. Thanks for listening to this episode of Science Nights in the Morning. Be sure and follow us on Patreon for exclusive gear and uncut episodes. Check out the latest science articles on our Facebook page and subscribe to us on YouTube and your favorite podcast listening app. You can also listen every Saturday at 10 a.m. Central Standard Time at BigBenRadio.com. And if you got a question, we'll join the discussion. Hit the hotline at 432-217-1983 and record your message. We couldn't do this without you, and thank you so much for listening each and every week. That's Science Nights in the Morning with a K, and we'll see you next time.